Ceasefire by Rose Mackey. Getting to know each other. The landing bay was eerily quiet in the pre-dawn light, most of the colony's day shift workers still at home brewing their first cups of coffee. Rowen suppressed a yawn as she approached the duty officer's station, datapad tucked under one arm. She'd stayed up late completing the preliminary plant analysis, determined to get off on the right foot and prove herself after yesterday's awkward first day. "Good morning," she greeted the Verit pilot on duty. "I'm here for the 0600 transport to Casti." The pilot, Roden Parr, according to his insignia, glanced up from his console. "Of course, lady, I'll be happy to take you." She really wasn't good at mornings. She stifled another yawn. "Great, I'll just grab a caffeine drink while I wait for Petre, then we can be off." Roden raised his eyebrows. I'm sorry, lady, but Petre-De already departed for Casti an hour ago." Rowen blinked, thrown off balance. "He, what?" "Took the first transport at 0500. Roden was apologetic. "Said he had preliminary work to complete. I'm sorry, there must have been some confusion. Perhaps he didn't know he was meant to be your escort." "I see." She didn't actually, but she'd be damned if she let his rudeness derail her. "Yes, of course, just a mix-up. Well, I still need transport to Casti. Can you—" "Of course, lady." He gestured towards the small office. "Why don't you help yourself to a warm drink while I prep the flyer? It'll be a few minutes." She plastered a smile on her face, hiding her fury as she stalked to the small office kitchenette. It was far too early for this shit. The coffee machine hummed to life under her agitated jab, and she drummed her fingers impatiently against the counter while it brewed. She yanked open drawers looking for sweetener, slamming them shut with more force than necessary when they didn't immediately yield what she wanted. It was not this poor pilot's fault that Petre was an asshole, she reminded herself, violently stirring her coffee until it nearly sloshed over the rim. She dumped in another spoonful of sweetener, as if the additional sugar might somehow counteract the bitterness of being stood up by her new boss. He's such a dick, a rude, mangy, disgusting rude. "The flyer is ready, lady." The pilot's polite interruption derailed her inner monologue, and she realized he stood awkwardly in the door, waiting for her. Rowen boarded the flyer. Her fingers tightened on her datapad as she imagined smashing it right over the Petre's arrogant face. The flight to Casti passed in edgy silence, the gentle hum of the engines doing nothing to soothe Rowen's growing irritation. With each passing minute, her indignation multiplied, festering into full-blown anger. She stared out the viewpoint, watching the landscape blur beneath them, rehearsing increasingly scathing remarks in her head. Who did he think he was? First day on a project together and he'd already shown spectacular disrespect for her time. It wasn't just the casual dismissal of their planned meeting time. It was the way he'd gone out of his way to avoid her, slinking off at dawn like some guilty creature rather than face her like a professional. Did he think so little of her that she didn't even deserve a message, a notification, anything? By the time they approached Casti's imposing silhouette against the violet sky, Rowen's knuckles were white around her datapad, her jaw clenched tight enough to ache. If Petre-De thought she would just meekly accept this treatment, he was about to get a rude awakening. She found him exactly where she'd expected, already deeply absorbed in work at the main lab. When she stomped in, he looked up at her in surprise. Just for a moment, she thought she sensed a splinter of guilt from him, before the odd smokescreen of his emotions wavered and obscured it. But she didn't care. She hoped he felt guilty after abandoning her so rudely. The flyer ride had done absolutely nothing to curb the edge of her temper. If anything, it had honed it to a razor-sharp point. "Good morning, Petre. You're here early," she said pointedly, her voice dripping with false pleasantness. His fingers stilled on the controls for a fraction of a second. "Lady May, good morning." Lady May again, is it? She set her datapad down with a click that echoed through the room. "Apparently, I missed the memo about a change in plans today." He looked at her then, his expression unreadable. I had preliminary work to complete. I didn't think you needed supervision during transportation. We can proceed for our first meeting at 0700 as scheduled. Supervision? The word emerged sharper than intended, slicing through his excuse. Is that what you think this is? That's not... He cut himself off, jaw working. I simply meant that as an experienced engineer, you hardly need me to hold your hand while you take a short flyer trip. How considerate of you. She loaded her voice with sarcasm as she accessed her own terminal. Though, perhaps next time, a simple message would suffice. Unless basic courtesy is too much to expect. I thought Verit males had better manners than that. She pecked at the controls, bringing up the work she had completed overnight. Clearly I was mistaken in thinking you were a professional and that we might actually work together respectfully. I was up half the night completing that analysis, and I would have expected that at least you... You're right, he cut her off. My apologies. It was rude of me. His apology threw her off guard, letting out all her steam. She met his crystalline gaze, his arrogant expression, and for a long moment she wasn't sure how to respond. He gave her a little formal head bob. I give you my word it will not happen again. Oh, okay, she didn't really know what to say. See that it doesn't. Casti, Petre called. Let's begin reviewing Lady May's analysis. Rowen, she corrected grumpily. He looked at her in confusion. I asked you to call me Rowen. He stared at her impassively, then perversely he broke out into a small smile. Very well, Rowen. She would never, ever understand males. Ugh. Indeed. Casti's voice held what might have been amusement. Welcome, Rowen May. I look forward to our collaboration. Despite her lingering irritation, Rowen smiled at the AI's formal courtesy. Thank you, Casti. I have to admit, I'm incredibly excited to work with you. I can't wait to learn everything you can teach us. Let's start with the garden project and go from there, came Casti's diplomatic response. They spent several hours going through the list of potential plants for the garden, everything from vegetables and fruits to medicinals, but they quickly ran into a problem. We don't have a wide enough sample range, Rowen muttered, frowning at her display. Petre moved to look over her shoulder close enough that his breath stirred the loose curls at her neck. She made herself focus on the numbers swimming before her, not the solid warmth of him behind her. Show me, he said. It's going to be challenging to get enough root and seed stock for these. Some of these are proprietary strains that the planets will be reluctant to hand over. Petre frowned as he examined the list. Perhaps we should review the contents of my seed repository, offered Casti. The stock in there may be several thousand years older than the current iterations, but we may be able to rapidly evolve them into the stock we need. There may be other, hardier strains that are more suitable for genetic engineering. There was absolute silence in the lab. Are you saying that you have seed stock on board? Yes, I have extensive genetic samples from thousands of worlds, Casti said, many of which no longer exist. Would you like to examine them? That would be incredible, Rowen breathed. She turned to Petre. Did you know about this? His expression softened slightly. I suspected Casti might have resources we could use, though I didn't realize the extent of the collection. A door opened in the far wall into another lab space, this one humming with a subtle resonance that made Rowen's teeth itch. Unlike the sterile precision of the main analysis lab, this one felt alive. The biogenetic lab, Casti explained. This contains samples of seed and rootstock from thousands of worlds, millions of plants. They entered the room and stood, rooted in shock. Samples hung all around them, in suspended animation. Like jewels in glass cases of all shapes and sizes, each one held the potential for new life, for plants not seen in thousands of years. They walked through the aisles of samples, the air cool and fresh. This is extraordinary, Petre breathed. For the first time since she'd met him, his eyes lit with childlike wonder, as he reached out to trace the glass case of a preserved flower. The transformation was stunning, his sharp features softened with genuine awe, making him seem younger, more approachable. She was beyond astonished by both the specimens and this glimpse of the real Petre, and that was when she made her mistake. In her enthusiasm, she reached out and squeezed his arm without thinking. The contact lasted barely a second, but it was enough. His emotions surged through her, her empathic barriers suddenly gone. Beneath his arrogant exterior, Petre was a maelstrom of dark emotions so intense it made her stumble back. Anger, fear, guilt. They all crashed against her empathic shields and shredded them like tissue paper before he jerked away from her touch. The intensity of it made her head spin, sending a spike of red-hot pain shooting across her temples. But worse than the pain was the realization that she'd glimpsed something that was deeply private and fiercely guarded. The flash of raw vulnerability she'd recognized before his walls slammed back into place told her everything she needed to know about how he'd react if he thought she'd sensed his turmoil. No wonder he kept such rigid control. What she'd discerned wasn't just reserve, it was survival. "My apologies, Petre," she stammered, scrambling for an excuse to cover her reaction. Her head throbbed, but she kept her voice steady, desperately trying to conceal that she'd sensed anything unusual. "I got carried away." He searched her face, likely looking for any sign she might have noticed anything amiss. Eventually he responded, "No apology necessary, Rowen." His voice was back to normal, though she noticed his hands were clasped securely behind his back. "Your enthusiasm for the project is understandable." He smiled tightly. "No harm done." She turned away, discreetly massaging her temples as she considered her next move. Petre was still watching her with wariness, likely wondering if she'd picked up anything through that brief contact. "The genetic diversity of the seed samples in here is staggering," she said, deliberately focusing on the lab. "We have to have a look at what technology Casti has to support accelerated germination." He slowly relaxed as she launched into a discussion about cross-pollination. It was the right choice, she decided. Whatever inner demons he was fighting, he was entitled to battle them, however he saw fit. The colony's only bar was busy but not crowded, the evening shift just beginning to filter in. It was run by an enterprising Malurian and had been dropped in from space 2 months ago, ready-built from a cargo ship. Being Malurian, it tended to dark reds, tans and blacks inside, with lots of intimate booths and spaces, and a large open courtyard with a raised platform for a band to play. It didn't have a name as such, but most people called it Rocks, after its owner Ariat Rock, a middle-aged, no-nonsense retired Malurian soldier. She had no idea how the female had got permission to open a bar on the colony, but given she'd seen Cadet Morale and her Malurian mate drinking here several times, she had some ideas. By the time she made it to Rocks that evening, Rowen's frustration had developed an edge. She found Fila and Zira at their usual corner table. "How did your second day go?" Fila asked as Rowen collapsed into her chair. "My new boss hates me," she said without preamble. Fila cracked up. "I'm sure he doesn't. Petre's the most level-headed Verit I've ever met." "Oh, really? You were there yesterday morning." She pointed a finger at Fila. "Tell me he wasn't pissed." Fila waved down a server and ordered a round of drinks for them. "Okay, I'll grant you he seemed a bit grumpy, but in his defense, he was annoyed before we arrived. I don't think it had anything to do with you. Maybe he was just having a bad day." Rowen shrugged. "Maybe." She told them about the flyer situation. "He was an absolute dick about it." Zira was outraged. "He did what? That's awful. I would have torn strips off of him." Fila was shocked. "It's just so odd. I know a lot of Verit males aren't good at female interactions and struggle with boundaries, but he's been here for 2 years now. He is a senior colony administrator, and he works with Felosians all the time. It's not like he hasn't had time to acclimatize." She grabbed the drinks off a tray when they arrived. "I've spent a bit of time with him. He's an old student of Broken's and they're still close. I've always found him nice enough, if a bit of a stickler for things." I don't understand him, Rowen admitted, taking a long sip of her drink. 1 minute he's apologizing for being rude, the next he's doing his best to imitate an ice block. Maybe he's just reserved, suggested Zira. Reserve implies dignity, Rowen countered. This is more like emotional hibernation. He talks about the project, he responds to questions, he just doesn't respond with any emotion at all. She couldn't mention the maelstrom she'd sensed beneath his rigid exterior. That felt too private, too raw to share. There's a weirdness when I try to sense his emotions. It's like they're muted behind a dark pane of glass. All I get are odd spikes. Do all Verit males keep themselves locked down this tight? Fila and Zira exchanged glances. No, Fila said, surprised. They're usually very attentive to females, especially ones they work closely with. There's formality there, but there's usually warmth beneath it. They're a passionate people. At their core, they crave female relationships. Zira looked concerned. That level of emotional lockdown isn't healthy. Almost like he's hiding something, Rowen suggested, then immediately regretted it when both women's attention sharpened. Has he done anything inappropriate? Fila asked in a hushed voice. No, nothing like that. Rowen backpedaled quickly. He's just distant, like he's determined to keep me at arm's length. Maybe he just doesn't like you, Fila offered. It sucks, but I don't like everyone I meet, and I don't expect them to all like me. Not everyone is compatible. Zira shook her head. Verit males are almost incapable of truly disliking females, she said. It goes against their genetic programming. Even if they clash with one, they maintain courtesy. Well, this one missed that particular lesson, Rowen muttered into her drink. Though I suppose 2 days isn't long enough to really judge his character. Give him time, Zira advised. Whatever's causing his behaviour, it's unlikely to be personal. Verit males can be complicated. Complicated, Rowen repeated dryly. That's one word for it. She sighed. I know it's stupid, but I want us to get on. This project is a dream, and I think I just built it up in my mind that it was going to be this amazing, perfect, once-in-a-lifetime experience. That's a lot of pressure to put on anything. I know. She took another long sip. All right, message received. I'll give it time and try not to take it personally. As they moved on to other topics, Rowen found her thoughts drifting back to Petre. Whatever was eating at him went beyond a simple personality clash or cultural differences. But that was his business, she resolved. She was here to work, not unravel the mysteries of one emotionally constipated Verit male. Petre paced his quarters, unable to settle. His objectives had been simple: complete the assignment, protect his brother, stay away from the Phalosian. He couldn't risk her sensing anything. A soft chirp drew his attention to Kina, his Volpur, watching him from atop the environmental controller with concerned golden eyes. The small navy-furred creature's tail twitched anxiously, responding to his agitation. He forced himself to pause in his pacing, reaching up to scratch behind her ears. She immediately wrapped her prehensile tail around his wrist, tiny hands patting his face as if checking him for injury. I'm fine, little one, he murmured, though they both knew it for the lie it was. His early morning attempts to hack past security had been an abject failure. He'd nearly had a heart attack when Rowen stomped in and found him. Thank the goddess, she'd been too mad at him to really look at what he was doing. He'd been able to slip the jamming crystal back into his pocket before she'd seen it, but it had been too damned close. The memory of it still made his skin prickle with cold sweat. The sound of her boots in the corridor, the split-second panic as he frantically closed the display. If she had arrived even 30 seconds earlier, if she had been less angry and more observant. The thought twisted in his gut like a knife. His HUD beeped subtly, and dread settled onto his chest like the weight of a flyer. He'd known this was coming. Kina's fur bristled at the sound, her tail tightening protectively around his wrist. He gently unwound her, depositing her on the bed before he accepted the comm. Maman. Report, Bylelle commanded. It set his teeth on edge, but there was nothing to be done for it. He had to play the game and buy them time. Proceeding as planned, I've conducted a preliminary assessment of the security system. My initial attempts to get past it failed. I'll have to try again another time. He paused, modulating the anger in his voice. They have increased security across the board for the project. It's made it significantly more difficult. Kina pressed against his leg, chittering softly. Her presence helped ground him, even as Bylelle's voice scraped across his nerves. That is unfortunate. There was a frigid silence. Continue with your report. He took a deep breath, one hand absently stroking Kina's fur to keep himself steady. The Felosian engineer, Rowen May. The way Bylelle caressed the name made his hackles rise. Yes, I've reviewed her file. Quite accomplished for someone so young, and apparently quite friendly. The edge of possession was difficult to miss. Maman did not take well to other females playing with their toys. Kina hissed softly, her fur standing on end as she picked up on his tension. Poor Rowen. She was an innocent, had no idea what kind of drama she had been dropped in the middle of. The last thing he wanted was to draw her to Bylelle's attention. His heart clenched at the thought of what a vicious creature like Bylelle would do to someone like Rowen. Still, he was a Verit warrior, not a puppy. He bared his teeth in challenge and chose his words with precision, threading the needle between respect and strength. She was brought in to support the project by Broken, not me. He bit off each word. Her expertise is useful to the project's success. Bylelle was silent for a long moment. Remember the stakes here. A pause. Your father can't afford any distractions. She waited, and he refused to dignify her comment with a response. Eventually, she chuckled darkly. I do like you, Petre. You never do things the easy way. Her voice was a snake's hiss in his ear. I want you to access the engineering deck. Some of the storerooms should have engineering supplies. There should be some interesting technology that we can use. Yes, lady. I expect another report in 1 week. I do hope you will have good news to tell me. The connection closed before he could respond, and his heart sank. He laid back on his bed, consciously relaxing his muscles. Kina immediately climbed onto his chest, her worried chirps filling the silence as she pressed her forehead to his chin. He stroked her absently, taking comfort in her unconditional affection. Getting into a rhythm. The pre-dawn corridors of Casti held an eerie quiet, broken only by the subtle hum of environmental systems and the soft whisper of Petre's boots against the seamless flooring. He'd timed this trip carefully, early enough that even the most dedicated researchers wouldn't have arrived, late enough that his presence shouldn't trigger automatic security alerts. After nearly a week of hacking, he'd finally gotten in deep enough to examine the security protocols and find the least risky time to get inside the engineering section. He crept along the corridors, feeling like an extra in a cheap spy novel. The heaviness of responsibility for his father's and brother's lives coiled in his chest. Liar, betrayer, thief. The chant went round and round in his mind, reverberating until it took on a life of its own. Away from the main labs, Casti's architecture grew more alien, taking on organic curves, odd shapes and protruding bulges. The ship felt more alive here, its awareness pressing against his mind despite the psychic block. He assessed his approach with a critical eye. Amateur work, sloppy technique. He took a deep breath and straightened and made himself walk confidently down the corridor, like he had every right to be there. Below him, the deck plates turned orange. The engineering section. He had a rough idea of the layout from the tour, but he had found nothing resembling a ship's map in the database. He remembered Broken's introduction on the tour, how the ship was morphic. Perhaps it didn't have a layout, just threw up corridors and rooms as needed. The thought chilled him to the core. If that was the case, this was a fool's errand. There would be no random bits of technology lying around in storage rooms. They would be wherever Casti kept such things. He had to try anyway. He needed to buy time for Lucan to deliver a miracle and reach the resistance. It was the thinnest of plans, but it was their only hope, fragile as it was. He scanned left and right for an access panel or an open storage room as he walked. Time stretched. On the day one tour, they had passed through engineering in less than a minute. This was taking too long. He stopped again, weighing his options, and his swirling thoughts coalesced. This was a terrible idea. Sweet goddess, there had to be a better option than just randomly wandering around a ship that could reconfigure itself at will, hoping to bump into tech marvels. If he kept just walking around, sooner or later he was going to bump into security, and then both Lucan and his father would die because he'd be arrested and hauled away. He cursed his own stupidity at letting Bylelle push him into this. He turned to go back and stopped. The corridor behind him had altered. Instead of the long corridor he'd just spent several minutes walking along, there was a T-junction that definitely had not been there a minute ago. A hatch stood closed on the far side, alien script carved into its surface. He stepped towards it, examining the edges, looking for an open latch, then stopped. The ship's manipulation was painfully obvious, a path mysteriously appearing exactly where he needed to go, drawing him deeper into restricted areas. It was a trap, laid with all the subtlety of a snare for a novice hunter. There was no way he was throwing his life away for such a transparent machination. He turned and began determinedly walking away. Behind him, the hatch hissed open. Petre didn't flinch, but inside, the warrior in him roared to alertness, ready to defend himself. Broken stepped out and stopped, surprised to see him. "Petre, good morning. Isn't it a bit early for you?" Petre's heart rate hammered and he forced an amiable smile. "Oh yes, I was awake early this morning and thought I'd explore a bit." He gestured vaguely at the corridor. "The ship's architecture is amazing, the way it changes as you move away from the main areas." He trailed off. Broken peered at him suspiciously, and for an instant, Petre was 10 years old again, being interrogated about who broke into the bakery. Evidently whatever Broken saw satisfied him because he grunted. "Isn't it?" He clapped Petre on the shoulder, a casual, familiar gesture that made the shame in his gut twist deeper. "We're only scratching the surface of what Casti can do." Broken guided him up the corridor with a dry chuckle. "I understand your fascination, but you shouldn't be wandering around here. It's a restricted area. The security team is pretty touchy with all the new project personnel due to start any day now." Petre nodded smoothly. "Of course, my apologies." Broken waved him off. "Curiosity is nothing to apologize for. If you want a more detailed tour, let me know and I'll get it cleared through Odrin and Zira." Petre hesitated. He really didn't want to drag Broken into this, but there was no other way to get access to the classified engineering section. Guilt raked him with serrated claws as he clapped Broken on the back. "That would be wonderful, thank you. It's the opportunity of a lifetime. I'd hate to pass it up." Broken had been his mentor, his teacher, his guide for most of his life, his father's sworn blood brother. Broken had been another parent. He had trusted Petre, offered him insight, helped him settle into his role here, and Petre had just lied to his face. "I'll put in the request, but it might take a week or so. Tell me, how are things going with Rowen and the new project?" Petre made himself smile. "Well, I think. Specialist May is highly competent. I knew she would be a good fit for you. I've been impressed with her skills. I'm sure we'll work together well." Broken gave him a knowing look. "She's a nice lady. You might try to get to know her a little outside of work. You might be surprised." Petre flushed and groaned. "Please don't tell me this is your attempt at matchmaking." Broken chuckled. "No, she's an excellent engineer. It's just a bonus that I think you two could complement each other well in other ways." "Right, I think that's my cue to leave." Shame burned again as Broken hugged him. "Of course, I must go. I'm on my way to a meeting. I'll be in touch about the tour when I've got clearance." "Thank you." Petre walked away. He didn't rush, didn't let himself look back. Not until he was in the familiar corridors of his assigned lab, where he could lock the door, and he let out a breath. That had been too damned close. His heart pounded against his ribs. Not from fear. He could handle fear. From frustration. From shame. From the sheer weight of it all. The lab hummed around Rowen as she worked, her fingers dancing across the interface with growing frustration. A week working with Petre had established a slightly more comfortable rhythm. Time and familiarity had softened some of his starched edges, though he was still standoffish. He often spent time off on his own for hours working in the other lab. Ah, well, she reasoned, there are worse things in the world than working with a quiet, gorgeous boss that leaves you alone to play with cool technology. She ran the simulation she was working on again and cursed internally when it didn't produce the expected result. Damn it. Maybe the 6th time will be the charm. From his terminal on the other side of the lab, she heard Petre shuffle, practically felt his gaze drill into the side of her head. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nearly fell off her chair. She wouldn't have been more shocked if he'd stripped naked and started dancing a Mallory and folk reel on top of the lab bench. In all their time working together, he'd shown about as much interest in her personal well-being as a rock showed in poetry. Yes. Her response was clipped. "That's the 3rd sigh in 2 minutes. Clearly you're bothered by something." "I'm fine," she snapped. Instead of taking offense, he simply regarded her for a long, steady moment. Then he shrugged and returned to his work. Her next sigh was deliberate. All right, even she had to admit to herself that it was petty. But if she had to suffer, so did he. After all, misery loved company, and her misery particularly enjoyed the company of the male who was causing it. Besides, if her sighing annoyed him even a fraction as much as his stoic silence annoyed her, she'd consider it a small victory in their unspoken battle of wills. She threw in an extra eye roll for good measure, though he wasn't looking at her to appreciate it. "This is too slow. Casti's concepts are incredible. The technology extremely complex, but it's taking too long. It's spending ages distilling its concepts down for me to simple building blocks. It's like trying to understand quantum physics through interpretive dance." She tapped the display in frustration. "We're losing so much in translation." He set his datapad down and faced her. One of the few redeeming features she'd come to appreciate about him in their first week working together was that when he gave her his attention, it was full and unwavering. Every time he looked at her with that focused stare of his, she was shocked over again at just how handsome he was. He was truly a beautiful male. His glacial gaze locked onto hers and her stomach flipped. Again. Damn him. If only he wasn't such an arrogant ass. "No," she told herself firmly. "I absolutely refuse to let myself be attracted to an emotionally unavailable male. I understand your frustration, but what can we do? You're trying to recreate the output of scientists from thousands of years ago that even then were thousands of years ahead of us, in another language," he pointed out. His logic set her teeth on edge. Language isn't just words, it's thoughts and concepts. Understanding their technology might take years. She glared at him, affronted by his reasoned argument. "That's not particularly helpful. I tell you there's a problem, and your answer is, yes, it's hard? Work with me here. Let's try to come up with a solution." "I don't have any suggestions." He shrugged. She narrowed her gaze at him suspiciously. That was a bald-faced lie. Asshole that he was, even she had to admit that he was terrifyingly smart. In the week she'd worked with him, she'd realised that Petre had an idea for every problem. He'd analyse a problem and dismantle it with disconcerting focus. So why was he avoiding this one? And why did she get the feeling that he seemed oddly happy with the idea it might take years? He returned to his console like the conversation was already over, and it scratched at her temper. Well, unlike him, she didn't have years to spend researching and theorising. This was a problem, and they needed to work on the solution. Goddess wept. It was literally in their job. She chewed her lip, considering. There was something there, in what he'd said. That's it. It hit her in a flash. We're trying to communicate in language when we should share concepts directly. Her eyes brightened. But we have a solution for that. Understanding dawned in his expression, twisting into something edged and dark. Whatever it was he was feeling, she could almost physically sense it, like static in the air between them. Okay, that's weird. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and firm. That is a terrible idea. It's a brilliant idea, she countered. The more she thought about it, the more right it felt. Direct neural interface with Casti would bypass all these translation issues. Absolutely not. He folded his arms, immovable as a mountain. You don't know what it could do to you. She stared, thrown by the quiet command in his voice. Seriously? You're an engineer. How could you not want to try it? He frowned, unmoved. I prefer my brain unscrambled, thank you. If she hadn't been able to sense his emotions, even distantly, she might have bought his logical response. Scrambled? Really? That's your scientific assessment of neural integration? His fingers curled against his forearm, the only sign of cracks in his composure. We have no long-term data on the effects of psychic bonding with AI. The connections are completely unfamiliar territory. Except for the entire civilization that built Casti, she countered. And Zira and Odrin seem fine. No scrambled brains in sight. They've been scanned more times than I can count. That we can observe, he said through clenched teeth. Who knows what subtle changes might manifest over time? Are you actually worried about this, or is this some male thing about being in control? The transformation was instant. The remoteness that she'd spent a week tolerating, his measured responses, the glacial aloofness he maintained, it all shattered like glass under pressure. His entire body tensed. Then he moved, fast. Between one blink and the next, he towered over her, and Rowen saw for the first time what lurked beneath all that restraint. His eyes blazed with an intensity that should have terrified her. Instead, she cocked her head in fascination. Why in the name of the goddess was he hiding this vibrance, this energy? Unlike you, with your reckless abandon, he bit out, his voice a low growl that sent shivers down her spine. I prefer to approach unknown technology with appropriate caution. Okay. She needed her head examined, should absolutely not be riveted by the way his reserve had peeled back to reveal this intense, passionate creature. But after a week of sterile politeness and emotional deep freeze, the peek into his personality was intoxicating. His presence surrounded her, cedar and barely leashed power. She found herself leaning slightly toward him. This, she realized with sudden clarity, was the real Petre. Not the ice sculpture she'd been working with, but this male that was vividly alive. Appropriate caution? She mimicked, stepping into his space. A small insane part of her wanted to poke at him, wanted to needle until he showed her more of the glorious vibrance of him. How did he survive with all of that locked up within him? The sane part of her pointed out that this was a terrible idea, and he was her boss. Unfortunately, the sane part won. His gaze dropped to her lips and he grimaced. Are you slow or something? I said no. His words were more effective than being doused with cold water. There he was, the asshole she'd come to expect. Appallingly, she blinked back tears, beyond pissed at herself for being upset. Damn it, she always cried when she was angry. No, she responded, voice tight. I'm not slow. I'm a scientist and an engineer. I push boundaries. It's who I am. For a moment he stayed there, staring down at her, then he closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were calmer, edging back towards the remoteness she had come to expect. I apologize, Rowen. His voice was quiet again. That was uncalled for. Yes, it was. She tried her best to make herself a stone, not to show how deeply he had cut her. Silence hung between them, and he cursed. That is the second time I've had to apologize for my rudeness. He bowed his head to her. I am sorry. Again. She sniffed, stiff with hurt. Then perhaps you shouldn't do things you need to apologize for. She took a step back, trying to pull them off of the emotional ledge they'd found themselves on. Look, I understand you don't want to try the neural integration. That's fine. I'll ask Zira to set it up just for me. His sharp inhale caught her off guard. You will do no such thing. I forbid it. Irritation made her words snap, burning away the last of her hurt. Did you just try to forbid me? Yes. He didn't back down, though saw him wince at her tone. As senior on this project, I cannot allow... Cannot allow? She clenched her fists, desperately wanting to slap him in his pretty face. I hate to break this to you, but I'm a fully qualified engineer. Who is currently working under my authority on a colonial project, he snarled, and I am telling you that neural integration is not approved for this phase of research. For a long, charged moment, neither of them moved. There was no way in a million years she was backing down. It was Petre that blinked first. He exhaled slowly, the muscles in his jaw flexing. You can't always push through obstacles by sheer force of will, Rowen. His voice was tight, resigned. Funny, that's exactly what's gotten me this far. He let out a harsh, humourless laugh. I don't doubt it. She stayed there, staring up at him in silence. Careful, Rowen. His voice was so low it was nearly a growl. You're treading dangerous ground. Am I? She murmured, gaze locking onto his. His fingers twitched, like he wanted to reach for something. Her, maybe, but was restraining himself. Yes, he said, voice like gravel. She deliberately stepped back, making it clear to him it was her choice, not a retreat. She saw the corner of his mouth tick up into a tiny smile of appreciation. She tilted her chin up in challenge. You're going to have to try harder if you want to intimidate me. He sighed heavily. That's what I'm afraid of. She crossed her arms. Look, I get that you're protective. It's literally encoded in Verit DNA, but I'm not some fragile flower that needs sheltering. You're smart. I need you to think past whatever this is. I never said you were. Some of the anger bled out of him, replaced by resignation. But neural integration is not up for discussion. Everything is up for discussion, she countered. That's how science works. We hypothesize, we test, we learn. We don't just arbitrarily declare things off limits because they make us uncomfortable. He pinched the bridge of his nose. Has anyone ever told you that you're remarkably persistent? Usually, they just call me stubborn. She offered a small smile, extending an olive branch. Look, I promise I won't do anything without your agreement. But will you at least consider that there might be a safe way to approach this? He studied her for a long moment. You're not going to let this go, are you? Not a chance. The corner of his mouth twitched. Then I suppose I'll have to help you work out how to do it safely, if only to keep you from being so rash. She beamed at him. See? Was that so hard? Exhausting, he corrected, fighting not to smile. You are exhausting. But I'm growing on you, she said with certainty. Like a friendly fungus. This time he actually laughed, a short sound that seemed to surprise them both. That is not the metaphor I would have chosen. Too late, I'm keeping it. She'd won. She wasn't sure what or how, but she was certain that she'd won a battle in a small private war she hadn't even been aware she was fighting. Now about tomorrow, he said firmly. It's late and I need time to properly document all the ways this could go horribly wrong. Always such an optimist. One of us has to be practical. She glanced back at him archly. Good thing you have me to balance it out then. Petre was reviewing the latest system diagnostics when the doors to the lab slid open. A hover cart hummed as it crossed the threshold, loaded with biocontainers, but it was the male pushing it that made Petre want to snarl. He sighed and looked up at the ceiling, towards the theoretical mystical realm where the triple goddess lived. Today, he called on the mother. Goddess, did I do something wrong in a previous life? Because I really don't need this today. He'd nearly had a heart attack when Rowen suggested neural integration. The mere thought of Casti rummaging around in his head, discovering his activities, had sent panic clawing up his throat. But instead of shutting it down like a sane person, he'd let just a hint of his anger and frustration come vomiting to the surface. His face heated with shame as he remembered how he loomed over her like some feral beast, nipping her with words, letting his fear push him into lashing out. But she hadn't backed down. He had spent the past hour trying not to remember how she tilted her chin up in challenge. She should have been frightened, should have reported his loss of composure to Broken. Instead, he sent her a sidelong glance. She'd met him with her own glorious anger. "Focus," he commanded himself sharply. He couldn't afford these dangerous thoughts, not with everything at stake. But goddess help him. He couldn't regret seeing that fire in her eyes, even if it had cost him. He returned his attention to the invader in his territory. "Varian," Petre said flatly, "I wasn't expecting a delivery today. It's unscheduled." The male's grin was as relaxed as ever. "The botanical samples you requested came in early, and I thought you'd want them right away." Petre waited for the rest of it. He didn't trust coincidences. Not with Varian. Then the pilot's gaze slid to Rowen, and Petre's chest tightened. "If I'd known you had such lovely company, I'd have arrived sooner." Petre barely contained the irritated hiss that tried to escape. Varian was one of the few Dathalka males that had done well with the females in the colony initially. He could never quite work out what it was about him that the females seemed to like, but clearly whatever charm it was, it wore off fast because he went through them like most males went through undergarments. Rowen, damn her, smiled at the compliment. "Specialist Rowen May," she introduced herself, her voice warm. "Agricultural engineering." "Ah, the genius behind the garden project." Varian's grin deepened, flashing a dimple. Petre felt an unfamiliar, unwelcome sensation in his gut. It was entirely irrational. Rowen was not his in any way. Argument today aside, he'd made a determined effort not to speak or interact with her. But he really didn't like the way Varian was looking at her. "I've heard impressive things about your work," Varian continued as he began unloading the samples. "These are from the southern continent. Had to dodge some interesting weather patterns to get them here today." "Your dedication to the project is noted," Petre said coolly. "Though perhaps next time you could come ahead rather than just appearing. Now, where's the fun in that?" Varian winked at Rowen as he handed her the manifest tablet, and she snickered in response. Petre shot her a warning look, but she only grinned, completely unbothered by his irritation. "Thank you," she said, signing the manifest. "These samples really are time-sensitive. The germination window on the purple sage is particularly short." "See?" Varian's smile widened. "The lady understands. Sometimes you have to trust a pilot's instincts." "Is that what you call it?" Petre muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Varian's gaze swept over him, lazy as a cat sizing up its prey. "Some of us prefer to focus on results rather than rules." The pilot turned to Rowen, his cocky look melting into something honeyed and warm. "Speaking of results," he purred, "I hear you're making remarkable progress with the garden plans. Perhaps you'd like to discuss them over dinner sometime." Petre was momentarily stunned at Varian's audacity. How dare he, in Petre's territory in front of him? Rowen was his what? "Not mine to protect," he reminded himself, as he wrestled the ridiculous instinct into submission. Rowen was a grown female. She was not his anything. But it didn't stop the sharp spike of fury that sliced through him like a live wire. Before Rowen could respond, he cut in. He couldn't help himself. "I'm sure Specialist May's schedule is quite full with project work." She glared at him. "I don't recall appointing you my social secretary." The rebuttal knocked some sense into him. "My mistake," he said stiffly. "I simply meant—" "That you're very busy," Varian finished for him. "But surely even the most dedicated engineer needs to eat occasionally." She chewed her lip, considering. He noticed she did that a lot when thinking. Petra's fingers curled into a fist. He didn't want to watch this. Didn't want to stand there and wonder if she'd accept. Rowen exhaled. "I appreciate the offer," she said finally, "but I should probably focus on getting these samples processed while they're fresh." Varian smiled easily. "Another time, perhaps." As soon as the pilot left, Petre picked up the nearest bio-container, focusing on it with unnecessary intensity. "So?" Rowen said, sounding far too amused. "Not a fan of the pilot?" He didn't look up. "He's unreliable, more interested in making an impression than doing his job properly." "Seemed to me like he did his job efficiently," she noted. "The specimens are in perfect condition." He looked up at that, eyes narrowing slightly. "I would prefer he showed appropriate respect for procedures that exist for good reasons." Even in his own ears, he sounded ridiculous and petulant. She didn't argue further, just transferred a delicate seedling into the bioanalyzer. Then, without looking at him, she asked, "Nothing to do with how he was flirting with me, then?" His entire body went rigid. His first instinct was to tell her it was none of his concern. But the truth burned at the back of his throat. Instead, he answered honestly, "I think you deserve better than someone who treats courtship like a game." She turned to face him slowly, her eyes widening in surprise. "I think that might be the first time you've paid me a compliment," she said. Petre held her gaze for a beat too long before turning back to the samples. "We should log these before the germination window closes," he said, voice even. "I'll be back." Petre stepped out into the corridor, the cool air doing little to smother the heat simmering beneath his skin. Varian hadn't made it far. He was leaning against the wall a few meters away, arms crossed, waiting. Of course he was. Petre's stride was slow, deliberate. He refused to give the bastard the satisfaction of seeing how much the exchange in the lab had infuriated him. "I like your new engineer, Petre," Varian said. "She's pretty." Petre stopped a step away, arms folding over his chest. "You will stay away from my project." Varian scoffed. "I was delivering samples. It's my job." He smiled slyly. "Besides, are you sure you don't mean stay away from Rowen?" "Rowen can look after herself." Varian pushed off the wall with his usual careless arrogance. "That's funny because you seem very interested in managing Specialist May's schedule." Petre didn't blink, didn't move. "I'm interested in keeping this project running without unnecessary distractions." "Is that what you're calling it?" he said mockingly. Petre said nothing. Varian had always been a male who enjoyed pushing boundaries, pressing at cracks to see what might give, secure in the knowledge that the Maman would cushion him from all but the most serious of offences. But he wasn't a fool. He knew when he was playing with fire. Still, Varian couldn't help but poke. "Tell me, Petre, have you declared your intentions?" Petre's jaw locked. Varian saw it and pounced. "Ah, that would be a no." The flicker of amusement in his eyes was still there, but it was sharper now. Less teasing, more testing. "You're wasting your time," Petre said, his voice steel-edged. "She's focused on her work." That's what she said, yes, but that's not quite the same thing as not interested now, is it? "If you're looking for fun," he said, voice quieter now, lower, "find it elsewhere." A heartbeat of silence. Then Varian chuckled. "Now see, that almost sounded like a warning." Petre held his gaze. It was. And this time Varian hesitated. "If you're interested, why haven't you declared for her?" he asked. "I'm not interested in her," he denied, and Varian laughed incredulously. "She is under my protection. She works for me." He looked the other male up and down contemptuously. "And she's certainly too good for you." Anger heated Varian's gaze. "You know how this works," Varian said, voice quieter now. "If she's unattached and interested, Varian was right. Rowen had no formal ties to anyone, no claim. She was free to do as she wished with anyone. But the thought of Varian with her, his voice came out low, dangerous. I'm telling you now, leave her alone. Varian held his gaze, and Petre saw the exact moment he understood. That this wasn't a game, wasn't one of their ongoing needles at each other. This was territory. Just as Petre thought Varian might finally get the message, the bastard grinned. You know, he said, I don't think I will. Petre exhaled through his nose, slow and measured. Varian was baiting him, testing just how far he could push, and they both knew how that would end. You won't find it amusing when I throw you out an airlock, Petre murmured. No heat in the words, no theatrics, just a fact. Look, I'm not an unreasonable man. If you had declared your intentions, I'd respect that. Varian paused, then twisted the knife. But you haven't. So as far as I see it, he lifted one shoulder in an elegant shrug. For a heartbeat, Petre imagined grabbing the front of Varian's flight suit, slamming him into the wall, feeling the satisfying crunch as his head hit metal, making him choke on his smug words. But he didn't, because ultimately Varian was right. Because he couldn't declare his intentions. Rowen wasn't his, and he didn't like her that way, did he? Besides, to declare any intention would put her squarely in the Maman's crosshairs. They already had him by the balls with his father and brother. What more could they make him do for a mate? He shuddered internally. Don't worry, Petre, Varian said, that self-assured grin back in place. I don't poach. A pause. But I don't walk away from an open field either.